Hello everyone, welcome folks. This is Saurabh and welcome to the Ministry of Automation. So I'll quickly introduce myself. Myself Saurabh, most of you already know, and some of you are new to our channel and some of you are new to our community. So I have worked in all these companies. Most of my time I work as an automator, as an automation engineer for automating the ERP applications like Oracle, SAP, Workday. So throughout my career, I have learned a lot in automation. I started my journey in manual testing, and then eventually I jumped in automation, and then realized that it just sounds difficult to learn automation in the beginning, and it's not actually the way we think. So, so with that, I'm trying my best to share the knowledge I have with all of you guys. And the today's session is on exception handling. So once again, welcome all Ministry of Automation. If you are not subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe and click on bell icon. The reason because you will get notified whenever I'm posting a new videos, which will help you. Okay, so first I'll walk through the exception handling in Java. What is our course content? So what we're gonna cover today. Okay, so first of all, we'll go through its meaning, that what exactly is exception. First we'll try to understand the meaning of different terminologies used in exception handling, and then we will see how Java handles exception by default. So we will see by default what is the default way of handling an exception in Java. Then we will go through the exception hierarchy. So we will start from the throwable class and then all the subclasses it has, like exceptions, errors, and then runtime exceptions and all those things. We will make ourselves comfortable with all the exception hierarchy, so that when we'll do a practical, you guys will be clear about what exceptions and which type of exception it is. Okay, then we'll try to understand from basics what is the basic difference between exception and error. We'll go over checked and unchecked exceptions. So these are some of these are very favorite interview questions. So guys, if you're preparing for an automation interview, I'll strongly suggest you guys to make sure to note down some of our points from this webinar, because I'm gonna insist specially on those points and examples which will really help you when you are explaining someone else about checked exception, unchecked exception with a real-time example. So feel free to take your notes. And then on the practical side, we're gonna do our customized exception handling. So first we'll see how default, if you don't write any exception handling, how the Java is gonna handle it. Okay, and then we will talk about handling them, right? So we will see how we're gonna handle them by writing some of the different kind of try block, try catch block, try with multiple catch blocks, and so on. So you guys know you can also write only try block. Okay, so that generally called as try with resources. So I'm gonna come on that at the end of the session if time permits, but the most important is try catch block and try with multiple catch blocks. Okay, so that you need to understand how they differ from each other. And then we will understand the control flow, how the execution sequence happens. If we have try catch block, how the execution sequence is. If we have try with multiple catch, then how the execution, how the control will be in your scripts or in your program. And then try plus catch plus finally blocks, and mix of catch and finally. So we'll try to understand in detail around this, and we will do a practical examples. And then we will see the different methods available to print the exception information. Okay, so don't worry if this sounds very new to you guys. I'll make it easy for you. And then very important and a favorite interview question as well, the difference between throws and throw. Okay, and the last I'll be discussing about top 10 exceptions, generally whatever the normal regularly faced exceptions in software automation or maybe in Java programming. And then we'll go over some of the favorite interview questions. So let's get started. So guys, whoever is posting a questions, please post a questions on the comment rather than in chat, because chat generally somehow I may get lost in the chat sometimes. So write it in comment, don't worry. I'll post an answer over there if I'm not able to cover in our session. Okay, so feel free to post whatever questions you want me to cover in the in the comment section of this video rather than posting in a chat, because chat, the people talk and it may get lost. So let's talk about exception. So what is exception? So as name indicates, exception is something, if you see from this diagram, it is something different, right? Something unexpected. So let's try to understand its English meaning, or try to understand its basic understanding about what is exception. So something goes wrong. Unexpected, unwanted event that disturbs the normal flow of the program or script execution is called exception, right? So if I try to think about the practical situation in the real life, okay, so what the exception will basically look like. So let's say I'm going on a road trip with my friends. I'm going on a road trip with my friends, and I'm very excited. I packed everything required for my road trip, and I made sure that we'll drive for next 18 hours continuously, and then we're gonna enjoy. But suddenly something unexpected happens. It's a flat tire. So when something suddenly unexpected happens, what happens? I'll first of all, yeah, everyone will be will be sad that we had a flat tire and now we're not able to proceed. So somehow I can say my journey stops, or in terms of technical words, the execution stops, right? We didn't expect that, the moment we started for a road trip, suddenly the flat tire came, and now what? Everything stops. So this is similar to your technical exceptions. In your program, in your automation scripts, when you're writing automation scripts and it's getting executed, if something suddenly happens unexpectedly, which you are not aware or not thought of, and maybe you didn't handle it, don't worry, we're going to talk about handling later on, but yes, as of now, let's consider you didn't handle that situation, then your script execution would abruptly stop at that point, at that code line, which you haven't handled or which you haven't even thought of. Okay, so in such scenario, what happens? Your entire road, your your execution suddenly gets stops. Now what if you have an alternate tire with you, right? So while going for a road trip, you thought, okay, let me have couple of alternate, an extra tire, so that if something goes wrong, I'll able to replace it, so that my journey doesn't stop. This is exactly similar to our exception handling in our technical way, or in our automation scripts. So I'll call this approach of this thinking of making sure that if something goes wrong unexpectedly, I'll able to handle that situation so that my journey doesn't stop or my execution doesn't stop, right? This is nothing about your exception handling. So with this example in our mind, we'll try to understand that how it's gonna work in our automation scripts, or how it's gonna work in our Java code. If suddenly something unexpected happen, are we able to handle it correctly so that the execution flow continues? Okay, so with this example in our mind, I expect you guys at least clear about what is exception and how we can handle them. Now there are different ways to handle it. We're gonna learn all of them, don't worry. So first of all, I will try to go through why it's important to handle exceptions first of all in automation scripts. So this session I'm specifically targeting for automation. The reason, because in automation the main intention is to find bugs, what's wrong in an application. That's our intention, right? But if we don't write our scripts correctly, and if the user gives unexpected input and because of which your script fails with an exception, somehow you are not able to achieve the objective of your script, right? You are not able to, the script will fail, but the script is not failing because of the bug in an application. The script is failing because of the exception in your script, right? So that is not the good way to write a script. So that's why it's very important in an automation to handle exceptions correctly. Now exception needs to be handled because they break the normal flow of execution. We already understood that if we don't handle exceptions correctly, our execution is gonna be abruptly stopped. We're gonna learn about that in detail. If an exception is caught, it would be truly exceptional case which is worth checking. What I mean to say is, if you have written your program in a such a way that anyway, if something goes wrong in between, I'm in a position to manage that exceptional condition. And if something like this happens, okay, let me do some more checks. So your automation is more intelligent now. You are not expecting that kind of input from a user, but if input is if some kind of unexpected input is provided by an user to your script and which leads to an exception, you may wanna catch that exception. And now, because you know there is an exceptional scenario, you may call some more methods, or you may do some more checks in your script just because you caught an exception, right? So let me give an example. In ATM machine, whenever you're withdrawing the money, a standard input goes like you go your debit card, the PIN number verification, and it checks your account. Are you available? Do you have a sufficient cash to withdraw? And if yes, it will give you whatever number of cash you are requested it, right? But if something unexpected happens, like for example, if some person tries to do multiple debit cards in between, or try to give some more inputs which is not expected or not being asked, he's directly going and hitting those buttons on the ATM machine, and which leads to an exception. So if you're not able to handle them, what will happen? The ATM machine will suddenly stop without giving a sufficient information to the user that what went wrong, and the customer will be unhappy, right? But if your code or if your program has made sure that if some unexpected input came from a user, what I'll do, I'll catch them and I'll report to a user saying like, no, you're not supposed to touch unless I process your cash, or you're not, this is an invalid input, and so on. So this kind of information we need to make sure that it's there in our program. So let's go through some of the advantages or why we need exception handling in automation scripts. So as I said, if you are catching exception, it will be truly exceptional to do some more checks. Reduce debugging time. This is my favorite. The reason, because sometimes the scripts in today's world, we are writing automation scripts which are so complex that if when it fails, it's pretty difficult to debug. When you go through the logs, you sometimes it's not that easy to find out the exact root cause why the script failed, at what point it failed. So that's the reason. If you have correct exception handling in place, then you can reduce your debugging time. Reduce false failures, of course, if you know the correct reasons. And then automation code is intended to find bugs, and you don't want to see many unwanted exceptions, that's for sure. And then your reports will be clear. Your reports will not have an exceptions, because now you are handling it correctly, so you can post the correct reasons, you can post the correct user messages. Now let's go and understand the actual meaning of try, catch, and throw. So these are three very, very important, I would say, keywords in Java, which you need to understand if you want to make sure that you are correctly using them while writing exception handling scenarios. Okay, so let's go and understand its conventional meanings. What is try? So as the picture indicates, you are trying something. So let's say I'm trying to do a weightlifting, or trying some sports blindly, which I haven't tried it before. So I'm just trying something. In a similar case, we will understand this in our technical code later on. What is catch? As you guys all know, catch is something catching, right? It's pretty easy to understand. Catching is if something is coming towards you and you want to catch it. And then throw, of course, throwing is something you are throwing to someone else, right? You have already that thing with you, but now you are throwing it to someone else. The someone else needs to catch it, right? So understand these three meanings: try, catch, and throw. Okay, because using this three keywords, most of our exception handling will be around these three keywords. So now you know what is try. I'm trying something. So here something, I'll say executing a code. In that, if something goes wrong, then it gives an exception. So that exception I need to catch, and then I need to throw it to someone. Okay, so we'll understand that. So let's say execution flow. So let's say we'll try to understand try. If you see here, this portion says when I'm trying something, basically when I'm executing something, if suddenly the exception occurs, or if suddenly exception, I get an exception, then what happens? I'll execute something else. Okay, so this is, you can relate somewhat with if else statement. If the condition is true, it's gonna execute the if block, but if the condition is not true, it's gonna jump on the else block, right? Exactly in a similar way, it's always gonna execute try block first, but while executing a try block, if something unexpected happens, or if something wrong happens during that execution which leads to an exceptional object, which gives you an exception, then what happens? Then the control suddenly jumps to the catch block without even executing the next code line in that particular program or in that particular method. Okay, we'll try to understand that in practical in detail, but right now you need to make sure that the basic terminology of try catch is in your mind. Okay, so like in if else, it executes either if or else, right? But here in try catch, it's not like that. It may execute out of 100 lines in try, it may execute 99 lines, and at the 100th line it may encounter an exception. But at that time also, the moment it gets an exception, it will jump to the catch block, and then it will try to execute everything which is in the catch block. And what ideally needs to be there in a catch block? Ideally, whatever we want to do post exception, like for example, in our real time scenario, the moment I got a flat tire, what was the next step? I need to make sure I have replaced the tire with a new tire. Those are my steps after hitting an exception, right? Exactly in a similar way in our method, once we hit an exception, we have to make sure what next I need to do. Those steps or those things I'm gonna write in my catch block. Okay, now let's try to understand the default handling of exception by Java. It's very important because once you understand this, you will able to read exceptions in your console or in your script correctly. Some people only see that, oh, there is some exception, that's fine, let me go and try to fix my script, but they don't understand the stack. They don't understand where exactly the exception came, at what point the exception came. If your program is straightforward, then it's pretty easy to figure it out. But if it's a nested, like you are calling multiple methods inside methods, or you are calling different classes, then you need to understand the way exception message gets posted. And by looking at that message, you should know where to go and what to fix. So for that, first we'll go through, if you do not have any exception handling in your program, then how the Java is gonna handle it by default. Okay, so let's take an example. So as you all guys know, the hierarchy of generally writing Java, we have packages, then we write classes inside it. Inside a class, we write multiple methods. So in this example, consider I have two methods. Of course, three methods including main. So let's say I have a class. Inside that class, I have main method. In the main method, I'm calling an add number method. Inside add number method, I'm calling another method, multiply number. Okay. Now what happens? In multiply number method, suddenly exception occurs, which I didn't handle. Okay, we're gonna do this practical. If something like this happens, what happens? Let's look at the stack diagram. So basically the stack is gonna maintain the execution sequence. The way your control goes in your program, it's gonna add those methods in your stack. So the first method which always gets executed is your main method, right? Then it's calling add number method. So you can see there is an add number method on top of main method, and then add number method is calling another method called multiply number method. So the next method in the stack is multiply method. Now if the exception happens at this place, multiply number, if this method is not handling, the JVM will ask what I should do. I got an exception, are you handling it? And say, no man, I'm not handling the exception in my method. So it's gonna go and ask the add number. It's gonna remove the entry from here, and then it will ask the add number, and it will say, okay, you are calling a multiply number method which gave an exception. Now let me know, are you handling it? Add number will say, no, I'm also not handling an exception. It will stop this add number and it will remove it from the stack, and then it will go finally call main method. Main method will say, okay, I'm also not handling that exception. Then what will happen? Ultimately, it comes to a JVM which has a default exception handler. And now what this default exception handler is going to do, it's going to abruptly stop your program without going further or without doing anything else. Like for example, if you have some resources open, some database connections are connected, or anything in program or automation script which are currently open or running, and sessions are in place, it's not going to do any closing or terminating of such things. It's going to abruptly stop that program and it will say, okay, I'm not doing anything else. JVM will stop it. So that is not the correct way, right? So default way of handling an exception says, if you're not handling an exception, then the only one answer is stop your execution without doing any further action, right? So like in our flat tire example, if suddenly the flat tire happens and if you're not handling, basically if you don't have anything else to replace it, that flat tire, then of course your road trip suddenly stops at that point. You're not going to proceed, you're not going to go further. Okay, so now let's try to take an example and try to understand that how it's gonna work. Okay, so let's say I have a program ready for you guys. So this is, let's say I have a class exception handling. In this, the class starts from code line number 3 and ends in line number 24. Okay, now inside that I have, first is main method. This is my main method, and then this is my add number method, another method, and then inside I have one more called multiply number method. So I have 3 methods. Now let's see how I'm calling them. So of course, whenever you run a Java program, it will always find, or it will always look for a main method and it will try to execute that. Inside main method, I'm straight away calling add number method, right? Just double click on this method, it will highlight what method where it is in your code. So now I'm calling add number method. So add number method is here. What it is doing? So basically it's just accepting 2 inputs, doing nothing ideally, but before returning their addition, it's calling multiply number method. Now in multiply number method, I'm just again providing 2 inputs. Now here I have multiply method. In multiply method, again it's taking 2 inputs, trying to do some calculation. Now here is the catch. Now if you look at this, divide by 0. In ideally, in Java, divide by 0 will throw an exception, because the answer is infinity, and there is nothing called as infinity in Java programming. It's gonna not understand what it is, so it will throw you an exception. We'll see what kind of exception, arithmetic or null pointer or whatever it is. We'll try to understand that. But yes, the last method, which is multiply number method, has some kind of calculations which may lead, or which will, in this scenario, which will of course lead to an exception. Now what, are we handling anything here? No, I don't have any catch, try, throw, nothing, right? So in this method, I'm not handling any exceptional scenario. So I know maybe while writing a code, I may not understand that this may cause an exception. So I just wrote this. Even compiler is not able to detect that problem for me. Okay, so for example, if I remove this semicolon, the compiler is telling me that there is something wrong in your code. And what's that? If you just hover your mouse on that red, it will say, okay, there is a syntax error. So this kind of information while writing your code will avoid some exceptions. Okay, we'll talk about that in our further slides when we'll discuss checked and unchecked exceptions. But here, looking at this program, I'm not able to find where my issue may occur, right? So now, if the exception is happening at line number 20, what this method is gonna do, it doesn't have any exception handling in place, so it's not even gonna do throw. Okay, so don't think that if it's not handling, it's gonna throw. No, it's not doing anything. It's not even handling, it's not even throwing. Okay, we'll discuss about that in our further slides. But currently here the exception happens. Now JVM will say, oh, this method is not handling anything, but who is calling this method? Let me go back to the add number. It will come to here. Now it will see, oh, the add number is calling a multiply number method, but this method is also not handling a exception. Now what I should do? Go back to main method. Main method, okay, this is also not handling. So as I said, ultimately the JVM will call the default exception handler and it's gonna abruptly stop your execution. So without doing anything else. Okay, so now let me try to run this. So if I run this, now you see I have exception. This is very important to understand. This particular exception which comes in multiple lines. Okay, in my case, let's say I have 1 2 3 4 lines in console. Sometimes you may see like 20-30 lines in an exception. Some people just simply ignore that what it is. So today I'm gonna teach you how to go through the such kind of exception and try to understand its trace. Okay, so trace is basically will give you the location of the exception. You need to understand, able to read that trace. Now here if you see, I ran this program and I got exception. Okay, it says exception in thread main java.lang arithmetic exception by 0 blah blah blah. Okay, so we'll switch back to a PPT. I have exactly the same exception message pasted so that we'll go through, try to understand step by step. Okay, now see, this is the exception we are getting, right? And we know, means because it's a simple program, as of now we know that this exception is because of division by 0. Now let's try to understand each and every component in this message, what it is. This is the name of exception or type of exception. Okay, so this is basically a class. We're gonna learn about the exception hierarchy, but yes, this is the class or this is the type of exception. What is the next thing? This says the reason is a message. Okay, so in an exception object, whenever exception occurs, it creates an exception object, and in that we have, let's say, 3 important information. One is what type of class, what is a message, and then last is the stack trace, the location of that exception. We need to understand these 3 things. Okay, so this is the type of exception. Then next is the reason or message. Now this Java programming, this is my package name. Okay, this is the main method which not able to handle the exception, so it occurred in that method also. This is the class name. Under my package I have the exception handling class. Inside exception handling class I have a main method, and this is the code line number of individual method. Now if you look at this message one more time, you'll able to understand its trace. Okay, stack trace. Basically it's telling you at what all location this exception came. So if you go from top to bottom, I understand the what exception I got. I got exception as arithmetic exception. The reason is division by 0. Where it came, the first it came at multiply number method, and this multiply number method, where it is line number 20. Okay, we're gonna go back to our program and make sure that it is at line number 20. But this method is not able to handle that exception. So that's why the exception, the JVM went back to add number method, which is the method calling multiply number method. Here also I was trying to see whether it's being handled. It's not. So it will throw it. It is basically saying, okay, you have exception in this method also, where it is line number 12. And then it finally went back to a main method, and main method is also not handling it. That's why I have exception here also, and it says here you have line number 7. Okay, so by looking at this message, now you understood that exception occurred at one method, but all the subsequent methods which were calling that first method where the exception came, all these methods were abruptly ended with the same exception message. Now let's simply jump back to our code. Now if you see the first multiply number, line number 20, you see line number 20, exactly this is where our exception came, right? Yes. Then at what line this multiply number method called? This is called at line number 12, right? So add number method, you can see in this add number exception Java line number 12. So it's saying, okay, this method also facing the same exception, and then main method is calling add number at line number 7. So it's saying it is facing at line number 7. Okay, so this is how you're gonna read the exception. A very first and basic thing to understand the exception. Now let's try to understand some more thing, which is the hierarchy of exceptions. We need to understand from the top class, which is throwable class, and we'll walk through all the different kind of exceptions we have. So guys, this is pretty easy. To be frank, it's not difficult. It just looks like difficult maybe initially, but the entire exception handling a concept is pretty easy to understand. But once you have these things in your mind from basics, you'll able to write your scripts or program very efficiently. So pay attention in this. Okay, now the first class is throwable class, which is the super class. Inside that we have 2 subclasses called error and exception. So now in Java, I'll not go in detail about inheritance and all. As you guys know, if you extend some other class, you'll able to use the methods inside that class, right? So this exception is a subclass of throwable class, and it extends the throwable class. Okay, similarly error is also a subclass, and it extends the throwable class. So I have couple of good videos around the class methods, how to write methods. If you are starting with this, and if you do not have much knowledge, understanding around those basic concepts, so I'll recommend to go back and go through those videos. It will give you a good understanding. Now, the exception class, this is the main class where we're gonna start understanding about different type of exceptions. This exception has a different subclasses, so it has a lot. Okay, so I'll just go through some of them: SQL exception, IO exception, and runtime exception. Now, in a runtime exception, again, it has some more subclasses: arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, array out of bound exception, and so on. And now if you look at our example, this is where we got the arithmetic exception. So this arithmetic exception is basically a subclass of runtime. Runtime is a subclass of exception, and exception is throwable. Okay, so this is the hierarchy. You may not need this in detail, but yes, in an interview it may ask you the difference between exception and error. And arithmetic exception, is it a superclass, it's a subclass of some time. So just you should know this, how it works. Now let's go back and try to understand exception versus errors. So I'll take a little pause here and go back to chat and see everything is fine. Are you guys able to follow? Just ping me in the messages, chat messages, so that I can proceed further. Are you guys clear till this? Whatever, what is exception, how the exception occurs, how to go through the exception messages. So just okay, cool, thanks for confirmation. Now let's go and try to understand the difference between exception and error. So in a real-time scenario, if I talk about exception and error, while you're driving a car, and if you suddenly get an indicator saying like there is something wrong in an engine, which you didn't expect, obviously, it's an exception or it's an error. I'll keep this question for you guys to figure it out. Okay, so when you're driving, you suddenly get an indicator on your dashboard saying like there is something wrong in your engine. Now you need to determine, or you need to find out whether it's exception or error. But in a real-time scenario, or at least in a Java, let's try to understand in a real case what exception and error means. So in a simple word, the something which is beyond your control, we can say it is error. Okay, which you are not able to handle, which you will not able to recover. And in exception can be recovered or can be handled. What I mean to say, if you are executing a program and suddenly your memory is full, like your heap memory or the CPU usage has crossed a certain acceptable limit, anyway the execution is gonna stop because of this resources or because of the JVM issue. Or suddenly when you are executing a program, the JVM gets some virus, or it is out of memory, or anything, like because of some system resources, suddenly the power failure happens, anything. So what happens in such scenario? Anyway your execution is gonna stop. That is beyond your control. As a programmer, you can't do anything in such scenarios. That is error. Okay, but when you're executing a program, and if something goes wrong because of the execution or because of the input output or whatever there is in your code, if something goes wrong because of that, then it is an exception. So as a programmer, you will able to handle exception, you should handle exceptions, but you may not able to handle error. Okay, very important interview questions. Most of the time people try to understand your basic knowledge around exception by asking this simple question. Please tell me the difference between exception and error. You should start explaining from the basic, like exception and error are basically the classes. They are the subclass of a throwable class. Error is something which is beyond our control, beyond our programmers control to handle them. And you can give some example like JVM has virus suddenly while executing, out of memory, or lack of system resources. And the exception, you can give some more examples like null pointer exception, we divide by 0, arithmetic exception, so on. Now let's try to go and understand and try to read these differences. Exception can be recovered, yes, that's why we are taking this session, that how to handle them. Errors cannot be recovered. I would say handled. Okay, so two type of exceptions: unchecked and checked. So this is also very important to understand. What is checked exception and what is unchecked exception. We'll go through them. They are also pretty easy to understand. Errors are always unchecked. Okay, unchecked is basically checked and unchecked. I'll give you a simple example. In real time, when you started your road journey, can you actually do your engine health check? To be frank, as a layman, I can't. Right? I can't check my engine's condition before I go for a long journey. But yes, I can check my tire pressure, right? I can check my fuel indicator, whether I have sufficient fuel to get started with. So this kind of some information which I can check before I start my journey or before I start executing my program, I can do some checks. Or if there is something wrong, the inbuilt system in the car is gonna tell me. For example, if I don't have sufficient fuel and I'm planning to go for a long journey of like 100 miles, then my car is gonna tell me initially with the help of your fuel indicator that this is what your fuel condition is. You may not have sufficient fuel to go for 1 mile also, right? So this is a checked exception. Just trying to give you some correlation. If you do not have sufficient pressure in your tire, it will indicate you from an indicator that okay, you may wanna check this. You wanna make sufficient. You fill up the have the sufficient air pressure in your tires. So there are some scenarios. There are something in your program which compiler will able to understand and will indicate or will tell you in a runtime. Not in runtime when you're coding. Okay. So those kind of exceptions are checked exceptions. Okay. Something which is beyond compiler knowledge or something which is beyond a layman person to figure it out are unchecked exception. Okay, so we'll go through them in detail, but just to get started with, there are two type of exceptions: unchecked and checked. In case of checked exceptions, compiler will have knowledge of checked exception and forced to keep some try catch blocks. Okay, so in a simple example, when you are writing a code, especially when you are getting started with coding, you would have observed that a lot of times you get that red hyphens and red underlines, which indicates that there is something wrong in your code, right? The reason, because compiler is an intelligent, it's trying to understand the way you are writing a code. It's keep on detecting that code and try to tell you that hey, you have done something wrong at this point, right? So it's trying to make sure that you correct that. If you are not initialized an array, it will tell you by giving some information saying like you need to initialize it, or if you're trying to do some string operation, if it is not correct, it will try to tell you there itself. So what happens? These are the checked exceptions. This compiler is having a knowledge of them, and it is trying to tell you that upfront, that before you run your program or before you start executing your program, please go ahead and correct this. These are checked exceptions. Whereas unchecked exception, it's difficult for a compiler to find it out. So that's why we need, most of the time, 99% of the time, we only try to write a exception handling for unchecked exceptions. Okay, so if in an interview, if someone asks you what type of exceptions do we handle in exception handling, are they checked or unchecked, your answer should be unchecked exceptions. Okay, now let's try to go and understand in detail about checked and unchecked. The same example which I gave you, checked are the exceptions that are checked at the compile time, right? When you wrote some program, we're gonna see the practical, and then the compiler is telling you that hey, there is something wrong at this place, can you go and correct it? Yes, that is your checked exception. Like in case of our fuel indicator, right? If I don't have fuel, then my car will try to give that that particular indicator. It will try to tell me that first you need to fill up some gas and then only you can get started with. Unchecked exceptions are beyond compiler's understanding sometimes. So they are exceptions that are not checked at a compile time. They occur at a run time. Okay, when you're executing a program, compiler will tell you if the code is clean or not. It will highlight exception during compile when you are writing a code. Okay, just in the layman terminology. So now you have an idea about what are checked and unchecked exception. Now this is where our main try catch handling gets started. Okay, So today I'm going to cover all these different combinations of how you can handle the exceptions. Now by this time, I think you guys are clear about what is exception, what is error. In exceptions, basically what we're trying to handle, we are basically trying to handle unchecked exceptions, right? And we also know the hierarchy of exceptions now, that it starts from throwable class. It has a two subclasses, exception and error. Error is beyond our control, so don't worry about it. We're not gonna handle, or we're not trying to write anything for errors. In exception, we have checked and unchecked. Checked, compiler will help you to correct them when you are writing a code. But unchecked exception, like divide by zero, compiler doesn't understand that there may be a exception when you reach at this code line. So that's why it's beyond your control, beyond the compiler's control to tell you that. So that's why it's important to handle that unchecked exception. Now for that handling an unchecked exception, we have certain techniques. We have some ways to handle them. And those are the ways we're gonna learn today. Okay. And what are those ways? So we'll try to understand try, catch, throw, and finally. Okay. Make sure that you understand these 4 keywords, and that's it. You will be expert in exception handling. Okay. You should know how to use them and where to use them correctly. So first we'll take a simple example and do practical around try catch. Then we will talk about try, catch, and catch, like multiple catch along with one try and multiple catches. So let's say in cricket you have multiple sleeps, right? So let's say try is something bowler is trying to get a wicket, and then there are 3 to 4 sleeps and they are trying to catch it. If anyone is successful, if anyone is able to catch it, then you are able to get the wicket. Similarly, if something goes wrong in a try block and that wrong falls under any of the catch category, then yes, you are successful in handling that exception in an exactly similar way. Then try, catch, and finally block, and then try with multiple catch and finally block. Okay, so we'll try to take example and understand all these things one by one. Now let's jump back to our editor. So let's create a new class. So I'll say try, catch, and then we want a main method. Okay, so now, so very simple, system.out.println, I'm saying hi all. That's it, nothing. In the class I have main method and I'm printing hi all. Let me clear the console and run this. Now in this scenario there is nothing went wrong, so execution is smooth, no exception, and it directly printed hi all in the console for me, right? Now what happens if I try to do, let's say if I try to do some operations, like I'm saying int a equal to 45 and then a equal to a by 0. So pretty vague, but yes, just to give a simple example, that I initiated an int variable, assigned 45 value to it, and then in the line number 89 I'm trying to divide 45 with 0. Now here compiler is not able to understand that will this during execution it's gonna face or it's gonna get an exception at this point, right? So it's not able to tell me that. So that's the reason. If I try to do this, int a and a equal to a by 10, now if I hover my mouse, it's trying to tell me that you need to initialize your variable. Now what happens if I try to run this? Of course it will show me that compilation error, but let's say proceed. See, it gave me some exceptions, right? And now it is of type unresolved compilation problem, correct? So unchecked basically. Now I'll remove this. I'll try to do an assignment. Now run this. Okay, now if you see, it printed the first line and then it gave me exception, divide by 0, where it is at line number 8. Now what happens if you are not handling this? This is how the console will post, or this is how the exception abruptly stop the execution of your program. Now let's try to implement a try catch. So we're gonna understand try, catch, throw everything, but so I'll just type try, open the block here, say catch, and then exception is the class exception E. So this is basically the syntax. Okay, so try, it ends here, and then catch, and you are trying to catch that exception. So basically we are trying to catch any exception, so that's why we are using the exception class, the super class. Okay, if you want to go specifically about different type of exception, then here instead of giving a super class exception, you may say, let's say arithmetic. So you can say arithmetic exception. This is also fine. We're gonna learn this. Okay, so right now I'm keeping it simple. I'm just saying, okay, whatever exception occurs, I want to catch it here. Now what you need to do here is just add this code inside this, inside your try. Now here, if the exception happens in line number 9, the catch is gonna catch that exception. And now here I'm printing one statement saying inside catch block, hey, you got an exception. Okay, so what I'm doing, the same code, I haven't changed the logic, but I kept that code inside a try catch now. So inside a try, I'm doing all my execution, but I don't know means if something goes wrong, I want to make sure I'm handling it. So if I don't want this kind of scenario where JVM doesn't understand who handles it and abruptly stops the execution, I want to make sure I have a catch block. So it comes here, and then I want to make sure inside a catch block I write everything, all the steps to do after getting an exception. Okay, so now let's clear the console. Now let me run this program. Right click, run as Java. Now if you see, again the system is again facing an exception for sure, but in this case the execution didn't stop abruptly. I didn't get that red line, red color information in my console. The reason because I am able to catch that exception. I am able to understand that if something goes wrong in my execution, it will jump to the catch block, and here it is the next steps which I want to do. So for example, I want to do logout. Once exception happens, I want to close my database connections, or I want to do some kind of files which I have opened, I want to close them. All those steps which you basically want to do before you stop your execution, right? So those kind of steps you should be writing under catch block. Very simple. So the first thing we understood is how to handle it. So now this is the customized handling of exception. Now so you know that if something goes wrong, it's gonna come to a catch block, and this is how I'm gonna handle it. Okay, so now let's go and try to learn about multiple catch blocks. So let's say I'm writing one more catch. So here I'm saying arithmetic exception A, and then here I'm saying inside second catch block, basically inside arithmetic exception. So it is showing me some error, so it is giving me some, so we'll go through that. Basically inside arithmetic catch block. Okay, now see, now I have two catch blocks, but now there is an error. Now before I proceed, I would like to hear from you guys. I'm tracking the chat. Can someone say why this red line came at line number 15? I have two catch blocks, and I'm trying to catch exception E here, and I'm trying to catch if let's say if arithmetic exception happens, I'm trying to catch that inside A, in this block, but there is an error here. And why it's so? If someone can type it in a chat, I'll anyway, I'm gonna explain it, but you guys can give a try. What do you feel? Why I have an error? So Rohit says because exception is the base class. Exactly. So basically the exception is a superclass. What does it mean? If any exception happens, any type of exception happens, if I go back to my PPT once again to understand the hierarchy, if you see this, if any type of exception happens, everything falls under exception class, right? Either it's SQL exception, it's IO exception, runtime exception, inside runtime, arithmetic, null pointer, array out of bound, anything. If any exception, any kind of exception happens, I'm trying to catch that in an exception class, right? So what happens here, if I go back to my code, if anything goes wrong here, it's gonna always come to the exception block first. So this code is always unreachable. The reason, because even if it faces another arithmetic exception, it will be catched in exception block itself. So it will never come to this block, right? Because exception is a superclass, so it will say, okay, I can handle this, so let me catch it. So it will catch that. So like I have 3 slips, and if the catch goes to the first slip, he'll try to catch it. Even if it's trying to go to the third slip, it will try to catch that. So I'm talking about cricket, if you're not aware of. So exception is a superclass, so that's why it will try to catch everything. So this catch will never be reached. Now how to manage this? So just replace it. So let's say I'm saying I want first to make sure that I am catching arithmetic exception, and then if there is other exceptions apart from arithmetic exceptions, then I want to catch it in my generic block, which is exception. Now if you see, just by changing a sequence, now it's not throwing me an error. So I have one try and multiple catch. So here, very important to understand, and always this this kind of small coding interview questions you may face when the interviewer will just write a sample code in front of you on a whiteboard and say, okay, can you tell me which catch block is gonna get executed? So first of all, you should know the exception hierarchy. If you really want to tell that, no sir, it always goes to exception class, so arithmetic will not be reachable, and you have to give the exact reason for it. Now here, this is the case of arithmetic exception. It's not a null pointer exception. Okay, we're gonna learn about null pointer exception as well. But here, if the exception happens, which block will get executed? This block will execute it. Okay, so now let's try to run this. So if I'm running this, see this inside catch block, hey, you got an exception. So basically line number 13 got executed, right? It never came to the exception block because the arithmetic exception is able to handle that correctly. Now let's try to give something else. So we'll try to make sure we get some other exception. So let's say xyz equal to, okay, let me initiate by null, and then I'm saying if xyz dot equal ignore case, I will give my name Saurabh. Oops. So I initiated a string variable, and then I'm saying check whether that variable is equal to Saurabh, and then here I'm printing CSO control space, so it will give you the system.out.println. I'm say inside if condition. Okay, save it. Now I'm gonna comment this line number 9 because I don't want arithmetic exception, because if the exception occurs at line number 9, it's gonna directly jump to the arithmetic exception block and it will never get executed. The if statement will never get executed. Or else what I can do is, let me do this operation after if. So let's say I'm trying to put it here. Okay, this is fine. Now let's try to understand this. I am initiating int variable, initiating the string variable, then I'm doing some operation on the string variable equal ignore case Saurabh. I'm trying to check null with Saurabh. So I'm trying to say, okay, if Saurabh is string is equal to the xyz, which is basically null, and then I'm saying if this is equal, go inside this and print this statement, and then after that line number 14 I'm trying to divide the a by 0. Okay, Now let's try to run this. Clear it, right click, run as Java application. Oops, I didn't save it. Okay, cool. Now you see, we of course we got exception, but where we got exception, let's try to understand. Inside second catch block, where it is here. But why it didn't catch it arithmetic exception? Because anyway it is written first, so it doesn't happen like that. As I told you, the type of exception objects get generated after hitting an exception. It will try to find whether the type of exceptions which the JVM has received, do we have a block specifically for that type of exception? If the answer is no, it will directly try to go to the generic exception class. So here, like for example, in our case, the first exception it hit is null pointer exception, right? So here basically this is null pointer exception, but that's why it didn't find a null pointer exception anywhere. So that's why it directly went to the generic exception and try to print this one. Okay, now if I see e dot print stack trace, let's run this once again. We'll learn about the what is print stack trace. Say this null pointer exception. So by this time I think you guys would have already understood what is stack trace. In our default way of handling, we understood that stack maintains your execution calling sequence, and the moment exception occurs, the stack trace is gonna give you the location details about where the exception came. So here I'm trying to understand where my exception came, line number 11, which is here, right? And then under main method. Of course I'm executing under main method, and then try catch is my class, Java programming is my package, right? So this is my location, right from left to right, package, class, method, and then finally my code line number. Now this is very important for you guys to understand. So now let me try to add one more catch. Okay, so now we are learning try with multiple catches. Catch. Now here I'll try to write null pointer. So just type null control space, it will show you. So any say so control space system inside third catch block. Now again it is showing me an error. Why? Because I know this code will never get executed because I have exception before this. So it will always, even if I get a null pointer exception like we received in this case, it's not gonna jump inside exception because it's not gonna go inside null pointer exception because the exception will catch it before the catch actually goes to the third slip. The second slip, which is let's say captain, he's gonna catch it for you. So the third slip or the third person standing in over there will never get an opportunity to catch that exception. So now what to do? Move this catch block here. Simple, right? Now there is no error in our code. Null pointer exception. First I have arithmetic exception. I'm saying okay, during my script execution or during my code execution, if you receive an arithmetic exception, please handle it in this block. If you get a null pointer exception, handle it in this block. Or if you don't get any exception, either arithmetic or null pointer, if you get any other exception than this, like array out of bound, SQL exception, input out IO exceptions, there are a lot of type of exception. If any exceptions which you get apart from these two, then you go and do the steps mentioned in the exception catch block. I have 3 catch block now. Okay, so now let's try to run this program and see which block gets executed. Okay, if I'm going fast, guys, please let me know. You can type it in a chat. I'm tracking them so that I understand if I'm covering fast. Cool. Now if you see that it says inside third catch block. So the reason because it got a null pointer exception. So that's why it didn't jump into arithmetic exception. It directly came to null pointer exception and it printed this line inside third catch block. Okay. So this is how the try catch works. Try with multiple catch works. Okay. Now let me try to use finally block. Now what is finally block? This is also important to understand. So are we guys good till this? Try plus catch, try plus multiple catch. And to be frank, in automation you no need to worry about writing multiple catches based on what type of exception you may get. But yes, means if you want, always you can, but you should always write the at least a generic exception for sure, so that any type of exception, then it will always jump to that, and you can write the list of steps which you want to do inside this. Okay, we'll also talk about who should handle the exception. Okay, that is important us to understand that who should handle the exception, or we should simply throw the exception. Okay, we're gonna come back on that soon. Now, are we good till this? If someone can just give me a confirmation, I'll proceed to the topic, next topic. Okay, cool. So now let's try to understand the finally block. So let's print something inside finally. I'm saying inside finally block. Okay, so now what happens if I have multiple catch and finally? Let's try to execute the same program. Now one thing we definitely understood is whenever the exception occurs, it jumps to that exception block, try to do that particular step and end the program, right? But now what if I have finally block as well? If you have finally block, it will always execute that block. Okay, so try to understand, doesn't matter if exception hit, finally block is specially be designed. The reason because you want to execute that piece of code inside a finally block, doesn't matter if exception hits or not. Okay, so let me first, what I'll do is I'll comment this complete code and run this program. So I commented all such cases which may give me an exception. So I'm running this. Now if you see this, it executed hi all, which is line number 7, and then it directly came inside finally block and it executed the finally block. The reason because of course I didn't get any exception. So first thing we understood is finally block will always get executed even if there is exception or if there is no exception. Now let me uncomment this piece of code which is basically responsible to get exception. Uncommenting it. Now I know that I have probable null pointer exception. After null pointer exception, I also have arithmetic exception, but this code will never get executed because the moment it encounters a null pointer exception, at this point, it's gonna jump to the null pointer catch block. And then from here, if you don't have finally block, the execution will stop. But now, if you have a finally block in your code, after executing the catch block, it will always jump to the finally block and it will try to do the steps inside finally block. Okay, so let's try to run this. Now see, it got a null pointer exception. It went inside a null pointer exception catch block. It printed line number 22. Then it came to the finally block and it executed finally block statement as well. Again, very important interview questions. If someone asks you, if I get an exception in my code, will this finally block get executed? What's the answer? Answer is yes, it will always get executed. Now if someone asks you, why do we need finally block? Why can't I do the same things in a catch block of an exception class? Like for example here, whatever I want to do, you need to answer it very, very cautiously, this kind of scenario. The reason because if someone asks this kind of questions, you need to say that yes, of course, there are some steps which I can do inside a catch block, but I know catch block will always get executed when the exception occurs. What if exception doesn't occur? In such cases, if I want to do something else, then what? So there are some steps which I definitely want to do. Let's say even if exception happens or if exception doesn't happen, I always want to do. So like for example, a equal to this, I always want to do, but this code will never get executed if the exception happens before reaching this code, right? So there are some steps in your automation or in your program which you always want to do. And that, for example, logging out from application, closing out the database connection, closing out some open files. So if you want to do some such steps which always should get executed, doesn't matter exception happens or not, in such cases you should write that in a finally block. So while answering such kind of questions, you need to give an example like, yes, I can do some things in catch block for sure, but what if exception doesn't happen? Then the catch block is not going to execute it, right? In such scenario, I want to make sure that I have finally block so that those steps will always get executed. Okay. So, so Sujit is saying he has faced an interview question in which the finally block is not executed. Okay, cool. That's a good good information, and I'll come back on that for sure. We'll cover step by step, and keep on posting such questions. I like them. We're gonna cover them. Now let's try to understand throw and throws. Very important. So let me go and clear all of it. I'm gonna clear everything inside my main method. Well, let me keep this code. I'll create another for you guys. So let's create another class. Now I'll say throws. I'm just naming it randomly. Okay. So I have another video where I talk about packages, classes, methods, how to write a method signature, the return types. So if you are not very comfortable around this, go through my ministryofautomation.com website. You will see all free videos over there, right from basics to step by step understand the required Java for automation. You don't need to learn everything, to be frank, to get started with automation, but whatever is required, I'm trying my best to cover it. So make sure that you go and listen those videos from the ministryofautomation.com. Now let's try to understand the throw scenario. So don't get confused about this throw. This is just the class name. Okay, I think I should have used different. Let me close this. Don't save. I'll delete this. I don't want, because I want to avoid confusion. So let's say I'm create another class. I'll set demo. Okay. Now let's say in this main method, we'll try to understand the throws. Okay, so we understood the try, catch, try with multiple catch, try with catch, and finally, right? So I hope you are clear about it. Now try to understand the throw. So before I talk about the technical, let's try to understand in a real life situation. If you guys understand cricket, so I'll try to give an example around cricket. Otherwise, I personally like cricket, so that's why. So let's say if you get a catch, if you get while playing a cricket, if you suddenly get a catch, and unfortunately that's a no ball. So who understands the format of a game? If you try to catch in a no ball, that's not a wicket. So basically, even if you catch that, what happens? You don't get a wicket. So what you try to do? You try to throw that to the wicket keeper or a bowler in order to get it run out, so that at least you get a wicket in that way, right? So in a similar fashion, let's try to understand the catch and throw. So what happens when exception occurs? The JVM will try to first ask the question to the method or to the area where the exception came, that hey, are you able to handle it? If the answer is no, then there are two situations. One is whether JVM will see whether that particular method where the exception came, if he is not able to handle that, then is he able to throw that exception to someone else, right? Basically the calling method. And if he is able to throw that exception to the calling method, then the question comes to the calling method. So the calling method should be able to handle it. If he is also not able to handle it, then he should be able to throw that exception to someone else. So the hierarchy goes till the main method. Okay, so let's try to see. So if I'm in a main method, if I'm saying I'm adding some more methods. Okay, so here let's say public static ABC. Just I'm not doing anything. Simple ABC method. So we have ABC method. See this, I don't have return type, so it says give me. The compiler says that okay, you don't have return type, I accept the suggestion, it corrects, right? Like checked exceptions. Now similarly, I'll copy paste, add one more method here, xyz, and say inside xyz method. Right now what we'll try to do is we'll try to call the xyz from abc. So just I'm trying to call this method. So here this is the way of calling a method. Okay, now inside xyz what I'll try to do is I don't want to handle an exception. So let's say if something happens in this method, I don't want to handle exception, I don't know what to do. So what I'll do is I'll type this throws keyword. Okay, so let's see what it says. Syntax. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is any kind of exception. If I specifically want arithmetic exception, then I can also throw that. But of course, it's always a good practice to throw a generic exception. So here I'm saying if anything happens in my code, I don't want to handle it using try catch. I don't know what to do. So I'm gonna throw that exception. But who is gonna catch it? Who will able to handle that? Then what happens? This, if you see now, the compiler is showing the compiler started understanding that there is an issue. This method xyz is trying to throw an exception, but the abc method who is calling this xyz doesn't have anything to handle that exception. So if you hover your mouse on this, it says add throws declaration or surround with try catch. So it's giving you two options. What are the two options? It says either you handle the exception by using try catch, or you also throw that exception to someone else who can handle it, right? So let's try to stick with throw. Now just add a throw again. So I'm saying I'm trying to throw an exception. Now if you see this particular method is throwing an exception to abc. Abc is also not handling it. He is also saying okay, I'll also throw it. So he is also throwing it. But now it comes to main method. If of course I didn't add this, so let's say I'm adding abc, I'm calling this from main method. Now if you see, the moment I added this method call, again it shows me two options, either throws or surround with try catch. So ideally someone needs to catch it, someone needs to handle that exception. So in our case, these two methods are not able to handle it. So main method will surround it, let's say either with throws. But if main method is also not able to handle it, he is also throwing, then it will go where? To whom? Let's see. Now I don't have any try catch here, I have all throws. It says okay, if exception occur here, so let's try to build exception. Int a equal to 0, a equal to a by 0, or a equal to 45 or 55, anything. Okay, so now here if there is an exception at this line number 19, he's not able to handle, he's just throwing. So the control comes here, and then it will throw back to main method, and then main method is also not able to handle, it will throw back to whom? JVM. Now let's try to see what happens. Run as Java application. See, none of them are able to handle. So if you remember a default way of handling a Java exception, it goes back to Java handler, right? Exception handler. The same thing happens. No one is able to handle it. Everyone is just throwing an exception. So it comes back to the Java handler, exception handler, and it abruptly stops your execution, right? So this is not the good practice. Now what is a good practice? Someone should be able to handle it. Okay, so now let's say here I'm not throwing it. Now what? In ABC, I'm removing this throw. Okay, and I'm trying to put it a try catch. So here I'm saying try. So put my code inside a try, and here I'm saying I'm catching that exception. Catch exception E. So I'm just printing I'm saying inside catch block. Cool. Now see, main method is not showing an error. The reason, because now it understood it. The A method has the handling code which is try catch. Now if I run this, see, the exception came in XYZ method, which is called from ABC, and ABC has a try catch, so it automatically went inside a catch block and it printed inside a catch block. So if you are not sure how to handle an exception, you should always throw it. Okay. And if you are writing a method which are mostly will be consumed by someone else, like function libraries, if you are writing a functions which you are expecting to be consumed by third party, or some other script is gonna call your functions, and you are having a possibility of getting an exceptions in those functions which you don't know how to handle it, you should throw them. And the calling person is ABC, right? The calling method should handle that. If he's getting an exception, then he should know that, okay, I'm calling XYZ, but what if something goes wrong in that method, it throws an exception, I should be able to handle it. So the calling person should handle it. The person who is able to generate that, let's say this one, then it will only throw it. If you're not sure how to do, what to do after hitting an exception, throw an exception and let the person who is calling your method, let it handle it. So now the question comes, can I have a method with throws along with the try catch? I would like to hear from you guys. Is this okay? Is this okay or makes sense? I want to leave this question to you guys, because now I think you guys are pretty clear about try catch and throws. So basically we use throws only in a scenario where we want to make sure that I am not sure how to handle this situation, so I'm just throwing it to the calling people, and the calling person will able to handle it. Okay. Now I think we understood about try, catch, try with multiple catch, finally, and also the throws. Okay. So now the last thing which is left is the throw keyword. So we need to understand the difference between throw and throws. So this is throws, which says, okay, if you get an exception, I'm throwing it. Now what is throw? So I'll wrap it up quickly. I know it's it's taking more time now. So here in a catch block, I'm catching an exception and I'm wanna throw from here, or let's see, not like this. Here, if I get exception, or before even I get exception, throw new arithmetic exception. So when we will use this throw keyword, so guys, you need to understand the difference between throws and throw. Again, a very important favorite interview question. This is throws, this is throw. So the throw, basically when you are executing or when you are writing a code and suddenly there is a situation where you feel that, okay, if such condition happens, so let's say if something happens, even if the JVM is not able to throw that exception, or because exception never occurred, but if you want to throw an exception in a certain scenario where the JVM is not able to generate an exception for you, then you can create that exception object and throw. Okay. So here there is nothing which will generate an exception. Here there is nothing which will generate an exception, but I want to create arithmetic exception and I want to throw that. So let's say whether catch block gets executed. So this is like manually generating an exception object and saying, and run this. See this, right? So here if I try to add print trace, so here what's happening, there is no logical calculations which would have generated a exception, but I am manually creating an exception object and throwing it. So here I'm saying line number 26, okay, if certain thing happens in my code, I want to generate an exception and then use the throw keyword and then create a new object, exception object, and then simply it will throw to a calling method, and the calling method will able to catch it. So if I try to run this program, see this, right? It created arithmetic exception. We do not have any divide by zero operation. We are manually creating that exception object, and then so this is the difference between throws and throw. Okay, so I think we are pretty much done with today's session, and I think we are gone through all the different kind of try, catch, finally, and the difference between throw and throws. So you should be clear about who should handle the exception that a person needs to implement try catch, and who is not aware of how to handle it should use the safe strategy of just throwing it. Okay, so this is all about exception, and you guys, I think, pretty much clear. This entire webinar is gonna get posted, so make sure if you have any doubts, go back and listen the video recording once again. We'll go through some common Java exceptions. Arithmetic exception caused by math errors, divide by zero, we just saw that. Array index out of bound exception caused by bad array indexes. If you have index of length 5, if you're trying to assign a value more than them, you will get that exception. Array store exception, file not found exception, you are trying to find or trying to perform an operation on a file which doesn't exist. Null pointer exception, you're trying to perform null operation on strings. And then number format exception, stack overflow exception, SQL exception. There are a lot of type of exceptions, but you should be being an automator, you don't need to worry about so much technicality. Just use exception class if you're not very detailed or very specific about handling a specific type of exception. Otherwise you can always write multiple catch blocks to handle each and every type of exception.